Sarah Martinez had always been underestimated. At 24 years old, standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall with a slight frame, she looked more like a college student than someone who could handle herself in a fight. Her dark hair was usually pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her quiet demeanor often made people assume she was shy or fragile. Nothing could have been further from the truth. Growing up in a rough neighborhood in East Los Angeles, Sarah had learned early that survival meant being tougher than you looked. Her father, Miguel Martinez, had been a boxer in his youth before an injury ended his career. Instead of letting his dreams die, he channeled his passion into teaching his daughter everything he knew about fighting. From the age of 6, Sarah spent her afternoons in their garage-turned-gym, learning footwork, combinations, and most importantly, how to read her opponents. "Mija," her father would say, wrapping her small hands in boxing tape. "Size doesn't matter if you're smart and quick. The biggest guys fall the hardest when they're not expecting it." Sarah took those lessons to heart. Throughout high school, she excelled in martial arts, earning black belts in both karate and Brazilian jiu-jitsu. She competed in underground fighting circuits where her unassuming appearance often worked to her advantage. Opponents would underestimate her, expecting an easy victory, only to find themselves on the mat wondering what had happened. After graduating, Sarah decided to pursue a career in law enforcement. She enrolled in the police academy, where her instructors quickly recognized her exceptional combat skills. Her defensive tactic scores were off the charts, and she could take down men twice her size with ease. But even among her fellow cadets, many still saw her as the quiet girl who happened to be good at fighting. The incident that would change everything happened on a humid Tuesday evening in July. Sarah had just finished her shift as a patrol officer and decided to stop by Mickey's Bar, a popular hangout spot near the military base. She wasn't much of a drinker, but her partner Jake had convinced her to join him for what he called a celebration drink, after they'd successfully solved a difficult case involving a series of break-ins. Mickey's Bar was exactly what you'd expect from a military town establishment. Dark wood paneling covered the walls, decorated with vintage military memorabilia and faded photographs of local service members. The air was thick with cigarette smoke despite the no-smoking signs, and the jukebox in the corner played a steady stream of classic rock and country music. Most nights, the bar was filled with off-duty soldiers, Marines, and local civilians looking to unwind after long days. Sarah chose a small table in the corner, nursing a beer while Jake regaled her with stories from their academy days. She was dressed in civilian clothes, jeans and a simple blue t-shirt, nothing that would immediately identify her as a police officer. Her badge and service weapon were locked securely in her car, as department policy required when off-duty and drinking. The trouble started when 5 Marines from the nearby base walked in. They were clearly already several drinks into their evening, their voices loud and their movements slightly unsteady. The group consisted of Corporal Ryan Bennett, a stocky man with close-cropped blonde hair and arms covered in tattoos; Lance Corporal Marcus Johnson, tall and lean with an aggressive swagger; Private First Class Tommy Chen, younger than the others but trying hard to fit in; Staff Sergeant David Rodriguez, the apparent leader of the group; and Private Danny Walsh, red-haired and freckled, who seemed to be the most intoxicated of the bunch. They commandeered a large table near the center of the bar, ordering round after round of shots and beer. Their conversation grew increasingly boisterous, peppered with crude jokes and inappropriate comments about the other patrons. Sarah tried to ignore them, focusing on her conversation with Jake, but their behavior was becoming harder to overlook. The first sign of real trouble came when a young woman walked past their table on her way to the restroom. Private Walsh made a crude comment about her appearance, followed by an even more inappropriate gesture. The woman hurried past, clearly uncomfortable, while the Marines laughed among themselves. "Classy bunch," Jake muttered under his breath, shaking his head in disgust. Sarah felt her jaw tighten. She'd dealt with enough harassment in her own life to recognize the pattern. These weren't just guys having a few drinks and getting rowdy. They were creating an atmosphere of intimidation and disrespect that was making other patrons uncomfortable. The situation escalated when the Marines noticed Sarah herself. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was the first to spot her, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. He whispered something to his companions, and soon all 5 were stealing glances in her direction, their conversation punctuated by snickers and nods toward her table. "Hey there, sweetheart," Corporal Bennett called out, his words slightly slurred. "Why don't you come over here and have a drink with some real men?" Sarah ignored him, taking another sip of her beer and continuing her conversation with Jake. But the Marines weren't deterred by her lack of response. If anything, it seemed to encourage them. "I'm talking to you, Princess," Bennett continued, his voice getting louder. "Don't be rude." The entire bar had grown quiet, all eyes now focused on the unfolding confrontation. Sarah could feel the tension in the air, that familiar prickle of danger that she'd learned to recognize over the years. Jake started to stand up, probably planning to flash his badge and defuse the situation, but Sarah put a hand on his arm. "Let me handle this," she said quietly. She stood up slowly, her movements calm and controlled despite the adrenaline beginning to flow through her system. Walking over to the Marine's table, she kept her voice level and professional. "Gentlemen, I think you've had enough to drink tonight. Maybe it's time to call it an evening and head back to base." The Marines erupted in laughter, as if she'd just told the funniest joke they'd ever heard. "Did you hear that, boys?" Lance Corporal Johnson said, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. "The little girl thinks she can tell us what to do. What are you, our mommy?" Private Chen added, earning more laughter from his companions. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been sizing Sarah up with calculating eyes, suddenly leaned forward. "Tell you what, little lady, how about we make this interesting? You think you're tough enough to tell us what to do? Let's see what you're really made of." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "Simple challenge," Rodriguez said, his speech becoming more deliberate as he tried to sound sober. "You beat any one of us in a fair fight, and we'll leave quietly. No problem, no fuss." The other Marines nodded eagerly, clearly excited by the prospect of what they saw as easy entertainment. Sarah could see the trap they were trying to set. They expected her to back down, to admit she couldn't handle herself against a trained Marine. And if she did accept, they probably figured one of them could easily overpower her, teaching her a lesson about knowing her place. "And if I lose?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Rodriguez's grin became predatory. "If you lose, you do whatever we want, starting with taking off those jeans and showing us what you're hiding underneath." The suggestion sent a wave of disgusted murmurs through the bar. Several patrons started reaching for their phones, probably to call the police, but Sarah held up a hand to stop them. Her mind was racing, calculating odds and possibilities. She knew she could probably walk away. Jake was already moving to intervene, and backup would arrive within minutes if they called it in. But something about the Marines' arrogant assumption that they could intimidate and humiliate her sparked a familiar fire in her chest. These weren't just drunk soldiers acting inappropriately. They were predators, who clearly made a habit of this kind of behavior. More importantly, Sarah realized this might be her only chance to teach them a lesson they'd never forget. If she simply walked away or let Jake arrest them, they'd be back on the streets in a few hours, probably looking for easier targets to terrorize. But if she could demonstrate that their intimidation tactics wouldn't work on everyone, maybe it would make them think twice before trying this again. "All right," Sarah said finally, her voice carrying clearly through the silent bar. "I accept your challenge." The Marines cheered, already celebrating what they saw as a victory. Rodriguez stood up, cracking his knuckles in an exaggerated show of preparation. "Just to be clear," Sarah continued, "when I win, you five leave immediately and don't come back to this bar. Ever." "When you win?" Private Walsh laughed. "Honey, you're about to get a reality check about what happens when little girls try to play with the big boys."
Sarah just smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach her eyes.
"We'll see about that." The bartender, Mickey himself, quickly cleared a space in the center of the room, pushing tables and chairs against the walls. Word of the impending fight had spread quickly, and patrons from the back rooms were crowding in to watch. Some looked concerned for Sarah's safety, while others seemed excited by the prospect of unexpected entertainment. Jake tried one more time to intervene. "Sarah, you don't have to do this. Let me call for backup." "I've got this," she assured him, beginning to stretch her arms and shoulders. "Trust me." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stepped into the makeshift fighting area, rolling his shoulders and bouncing on his toes like a boxer warming up. At 6 feet tall, and probably 200 pounds of military-trained muscle, He looked like he could bench press Sarah without breaking a sweat. The size difference was so dramatic that several spectators shook their heads, certain they were about to witness a brutal mismatch. "Last chance to back down, sweetheart," Rodriguez called out. "I'd hate to mess up that pretty face of yours." Sarah just smiled again, that same cold expression that was starting to make some of the smarter spectators nervous. She'd been underestimated her entire life, and she'd learned long ago how to use that assumption to her advantage. "Whenever you're ready," she said simply. Rodriguez charged forward with surprising speed for such a big man, throwing a heavy right hook that would have knocked out most opponents if it had connected. But Sarah wasn't there when his fist arrived. She'd slipped to the side at the last second, her father's lessons about footwork and timing echoing in her mind. The Marine's momentum carried him forward, leaving him momentarily off balance. Sarah took advantage of the opening, delivering a sharp elbow strike to his ribs that made him grunt in pain and surprise. Before he could recover, she grabbed his extended arm and used his own forward motion to throw him over her hip in a perfectly executed judo throw. Rodriguez hit the floor hard, the wind knocked out of him. He lay there for a moment, stunned, and trying to process what had just happened. The bar was completely silent, except for the sound of his labored breathing. Sarah stood over him, not even breathing hard. "Still think this is a mismatch?" The other four Marines stared in shock. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Rodriguez was supposed to overpower the small woman quickly and decisively, not end up flat on his back wondering what had hit him. "Lucky shot," Corporal Bennett muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Rodriguez struggled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and anger. "That was a fluke. I wasn't ready. Want to go again?" Sarah asked pleasantly. This time Rodriguez was more cautious, circling her slowly and looking for an opening. He threw a few testing jabs, trying to gauge her reactions and find a weakness. Sarah deflected them easily, her hands moving in small, efficient motions that redirected his strikes without wasting energy. Growing frustrated, Rodriguez committed to a more serious combination, a left jab followed by a right cross and a left hook. It was a textbook sequence that should have overwhelmed his smaller opponent. Instead, Sarah ducked under the jab, sidestepped the cross, and caught his hooking arm in a joint lock that had him crying out in pain within seconds. She applied just enough pressure to demonstrate control without causing permanent damage, then released him and stepped back. Rodriguez clutched his arm, his face contorted with pain and humiliation. "I think that's enough," Sarah said. "Time for you and your friends to leave." But the Marines weren't ready to accept defeat. They had their reputations to think about, their image as tough military men who couldn't be beaten by a small civilian woman. The fact that Sarah had made it look easy only made their humiliation worse. "This isn't over," Lance Corporal Johnson said, stepping forward. "You got lucky with Rodriguez, but lightning doesn't strike twice." Sarah sighed, recognizing that they weren't going to let this go. She'd hoped that demonstrating her skills against their apparent leader would be enough to convince them to leave quietly, but their pride wouldn't let them back down. She was going to have to make her point more decisively. "Fine," she said, settling back into her fighting stance. "Who's next?" Lance Corporal Marcus Johnson stepped forward with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a fight. At 6'2" and built like a linebacker, he'd been the base's unofficial boxing champion for 3 years running. His reach advantage over Sarah was significant, and he planned to use it to keep her at a distance while he picked her apart with jabs and straight punches. "I've been boxing since I was 12, Johnson announced to the crowd, as if explaining why the outcome was inevitable. "This won't take long." Sarah observed him carefully as he shadowboxed, showing off his technique. His form was technically sound. He kept his hands up, moved his head well, and had obviously spent countless hours perfecting his footwork. In a traditional boxing match, his size and reach would have made him a formidable opponent for anyone, but this wasn't a boxing match. Johnson came out fast, using his long arms to pepper Sarah with quick jabs while staying safely out of range of her shorter reach. For the first 30 seconds, it looked like his strategy might work. He landed several light shots on Sarah's arms and shoulders as she focused on defense, seemingly unable to get close enough to mount any offense of her own. The watching Marines began to regain their confidence. This looked more like what they'd expected, their trained fighter systematically breaking down the overconfident civilian who'd gotten lucky against Rodriguez. "See, I told you," Private Chen called out. "Johnson's gonna pick her apart." But Sarah wasn't trying to win a boxing match. She was studying her opponent, learning his patterns and timing while absorbing minimal damage. Johnson had a tendency to drop his left hand slightly after throwing a right jab, leaving a brief opening. He also had a habit of shifting his weight onto his back foot when he thought he was out of range, preparing to spring forward with his next combination. When Sarah was ready, she made her move. Johnson threw another right jab, following his established pattern. Sarah slipped the punch and exploded forward, closing the distance faster than he thought possible. Before he could reset his guard, she was inside his reach, too close for his boxing skills to be effective. What happened next was a masterclass in close-quarters combat. Sarah grabbed Johnson's lead arm and used it to control his posture while she delivered a series of short, devastating strikes to his body. Her elbow found his solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs. Her knee struck his thigh, deadening the muscle and making him stumble. Johnson tried to clinch, hoping to use his size advantage to tie her up, but Sarah was already moving. She ducked under his reaching arms and swept his legs, sending him crashing to the floor. Before he could even think about getting back up, Sarah had secured a rear naked choke, cutting off the blood flow to his brain. "Tap out," she said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. Johnson struggled for a few seconds, his military pride warring with the very real possibility of losing consciousness. But as black spots began to appear at the edges of his vision, survival instincts took over. He tapped frantically on Sarah's arm, and she immediately released the hold. Johnson gasped and coughed as blood flow returned to his brain, his face flushed with embarrassment and oxygen deprivation. The bar was silent except for his labored breathing and the low hum of the air conditioning. "Two down," Sarah said, standing up and brushing imaginary dust off her jeans. She looked completely calm, as if she'd just finished a light workout, instead of dismantling two trained fighters. Private First Class Tommy Chen was the next to step forward, but his earlier bravado had evaporated. At 19, he was the youngest of the Marines and had joined their harassment of Sarah more out of peer pressure than genuine aggression. Now, faced with the reality of what he was up against, he looked like he was seriously regretting his life choices. "Maybe we should just leave," Chen said quietly to his remaining companions. "Like hell," Private Danny Walsh shot back, though his voice cracked slightly. "We're Marines. We don't run from some girl." Walsh himself was clearly struggling with the decision of whether to step up next. His earlier intoxication had burned off under the stress of watching his friends get systematically defeated, leaving him uncomfortably sober and aware of what was happening. Sarah watched them debate among themselves, curious to see how far their pride would push them. She wasn't particularly interested in fighting all 5 Marines, her point had been made twice over. But she also knew that backing down now might send the wrong message. These men needed to understand that their behavior had consequences. "Look," Sarah said, addressing the group, "you've seen what I can do. Your friends are going to be fine, but their egos are going to hurt for a while. You can either cut your losses and leave now, or we can continue this until all 5 of you are on the floor. Your choice." Chen took a step toward the exit, but Walsh grabbed his arm. "We finish this," Walsh declared, stepping into the fighting area. "All of us." Private Walsh had different plans than his predecessors. Instead of trying to outbox or outgrapple Sarah, he decided to use his military training in a different way. He'd been taught that in real combat, rules didn't matter, only survival. If that meant fighting dirty, so be it. Walsh came forward in a rush, throwing wild, unpredictable strikes that forced Sarah to focus on defense. Then, when he thought she was distracted, he attempted to grab a handful of dirt from a potted plant near the makeshift fighting area, planning to throw it in her eyes. Sarah saw the move coming and reacted instantly. Before Walsh could complete his dirty trick, she closed the distance and delivered a precise strike to his wrist, causing him to drop the dirt and cry out in pain. The attempted cheap shot had crossed a line in Sarah's mind. This was no longer just about teaching a lesson in respect. What followed was the most decisive victory yet. Sarah's movements became more aggressive, more punishing. She caught Walsh's clumsy follow-up punch and used it to spin him around into a standing armbar. The hyperextension of his elbow joint was immediate and agonizing. "Yield," Sarah commanded, applying just enough pressure to make her point without causing permanent damage. Walsh held out for perhaps 3 seconds before the pain became unbearable. "I yield. I yield." Sarah released him immediately, and Walsh collapsed to his knees, clutching his arm and trying not to cry in front of his friends and the crowd of spectators. Private Chen looked around at his defeated companions, then back at Sarah, who wasn't even breathing hard despite having fought 3 men in rapid succession. The smart play was obvious, but admitting defeat meant accepting humiliation in front of everyone in the bar. "I don't want to fight," Chen said quietly. "Then don't," Sarah replied. "Walk away. Take your friends and leave." For a moment, it looked like the confrontation might end there. Chen was clearly the most reasonable of the group, and with 3 of his companions already defeated, continuing seemed pointless. But as Chen turned toward the exit, Corporal Bennett stepped forward to block his path. "Where do you think you're going?" Bennett demanded. "This is over, man," Chen replied. "She beat all of you. What's the point?" "The point is we're Marines," Bennett shot back, his face red with anger and embarrassment. "We don't get humiliated by some civilian and just walk away." Bennett was perhaps the most dangerous of the 5, not because of his size or training, but because of his mindset. Unlike the others, who had started the confrontation as drunken harassment and escalated due to wounded pride, Bennett seemed to take Sarah's victories as a personal insult that demanded violent retribution. He approached the fighting area with obvious hostile intent, cracking his knuckles and rolling his shoulders. His tattoos, Sarah noticed, included several that suggested associations with less than honorable military units and extremist groups. "I'm going to enjoy this," Bennett said, his voice low and menacing. "You've embarrassed my friends, and now you're going to pay for it." Where she'd been calm and controlled with the previous opponents, almost teacherly in her approach, now there was a harder edge to her stance. She recognized the type. Bennett wasn't just a drunk Marine acting inappropriately. He was someone who enjoyed causing pain and saw violence as a solution to problems. "Last chance to walk away," Sarah offered. Bennett's response was immediate and vicious. He charged forward with a vicious haymaker punch aimed at Sarah's head, putting his full body weight behind the strike. It was the kind of punch that could cause serious injury if it connected. Sarah didn't just dodge the attack. She turned Bennett's aggression against him. As his punch whistled past her head, she grabbed his extended arm and used his own momentum to slam him face first into the nearest wall. The impact was solid and unmistakable, the sound echoing through the silent bar. Bennett bounced off the wall, blood streaming from his nose, but he wasn't finished. Wiping blood from his face, he came at Sarah again, this time pulling a small folding knife from his pocket. The appearance of the weapon changed everything. What had been a bar fight, however lopsided, was now a potentially deadly situation. Several patrons screamed and moved toward the exits, while others reached for their phones to call 911. But Sarah didn't panic. If anything, she seemed to become more focused, more dangerous. Her years of police training had included extensive work with edged weapons, both in terms of defense and disarmament. Bennett slashed wildly with the knife, trying to force Sarah into a corner where he could land a decisive blow, but his technique was poor, his swings telegraphed and desperate rather than controlled. Sarah waited for her opportunity, then struck with surgical precision. She caught Bennett's knife hand at the wrist, controlling the weapon while she drove her knee into his solar plexus. As he doubled over, gasping for air, she applied a joint lock that forced him to drop the knife. A quick follow-up strike to a pressure point on his neck sent him to his knees, then to unconsciousness. Bennett collapsed to the floor, the knife skittering across the room. Sarah picked it up and handed it to Mickey, the bartender, who was watching the proceedings with a mixture of awe and concern.
4 down, Sarah announced, looking at the last remaining Marine. Private Chen stood alone among his defeated friends, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly.
He looked around the room at the watching faces, at his unconscious and groaning companions, then back at Sarah, who stood calmly in the center of it all. "I don't want any trouble," Chen said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then you shouldn't have started any," Sarah replied, "but since you did, we're going to finish it." Chen looked like he might cry. At 19, he was barely out of high school, and the reality of the situation was finally sinking in. He'd gotten caught up in his friends' harassment and aggression, following their lead without really thinking about the consequences. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of deception or continued hostility. What she saw was a scared kid who'd made bad choices under peer pressure. It didn't excuse his behavior, but it did suggest a different approach might be appropriate. "Sorry isn't enough," Sarah said. "Actions have consequences. But I'll give you a choice. You can fight me like your friends did, or you can accept responsibility and face the consequences like an adult." "What kind of consequences?" Chen asked nervously. "You and your friends are going to be arrested for assault, harassment, and in Bennett's case, assault with a deadly weapon. You're going to face military justice as well as civilian charges, and you're going to be banned from this establishment permanently." Chen's shoulders sagged as the full weight of the situation hit him. His military career was probably over before it had really begun. Criminal charges would follow him for the rest of his life. "But," Sarah continued, "if you can convince me that you understand why what you did was wrong and that you're genuinely committed to changing your behavior, I might be willing to put in a word with the prosecutors." Chen looked around the room again, seeing the faces of other patrons who had witnessed the entire confrontation. He saw disgust in some expressions, but also what might have been sympathy in others. "What we did was wrong," Chen said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "We thought we could intimidate you because you were alone and smaller than us. We objectified you and made you uncomfortable, and when you stood up to us, we tried to use violence to put you in your place. It was cowardly and disrespectful." Sarah nodded. And we were representing the Marine Corps poorly. We were supposed to be protectors, but instead we were acting like predators. We dishonored our uniforms and our service. What are you going to do differently in the future?" Chen thought for a moment. "I'm going to remember this night every time I'm tempted to go along with something I know is wrong. I'm going to stand up to my friends when they're acting inappropriately, even if it means being unpopular. And I'm going to treat everyone, especially women, with the respect they deserve." Sarah studied his face one more time, then nodded slowly. "That's a good start. But words are easy. Actions are what matter." She turned to address the room. "I think everyone here has learned something tonight about making assumptions based on appearances. Sometimes the person you think is an easy target turns out to be anything but." Jake appeared at her side, having finally worked his way through the crowd. "Police and ambulance are on the way," he said quietly. "Good," Sarah replied. "These 4 are going to need medical attention, and Chen here is going to cooperate fully with the investigation." As sirens began to wail in the distance, Sarah looked around at the aftermath of the confrontation. 4 Marines lay defeated on the floor in various stages of consciousness and pain, while the 5th stood looking like his world had just been turned upside down. It wasn't how she'd planned to spend her evening, but sometimes life forced you to make a stand when you least expected it. The important thing was being ready when that moment came. The arrival of emergency services transformed Mickey's bar from a scene of confrontation into a carefully controlled crime scene. 3 police cruisers and 2 ambulances filled the parking lot, their flashing lights casting red and blue shadows through the windows. Inside, paramedics worked to assess the condition of the 4 defeated Marines while officers began the complex process of documenting what had happened. Detective Lieutenant Maria Gonzalez was the first ranking officer to arrive. A 20-year veteran of the force, she'd seen her share of bar fights, but this one was already shaping up to be something unusual. The initial radio reports had mentioned multiple assaults, weapons involved, and at least 4 individuals requiring medical attention. What she found, instead, was a remarkably calm scene, with one small woman sitting quietly at a table, giving her statement to Officer Jake Morrison. "Let me get this straight," Lieutenant Gonzalez said after Jake had briefed her on the situation. "Officer Martinez took down 4 Marines in hand-to-hand combat?" "5 Marines," Jake corrected. "Chen there didn't actually fight, but he was part of the group that started the harassment." Gonzalez looked skeptically between the slight Sarah and the much larger men being treated by paramedics. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was conscious but holding his ribs and complaining of breathing difficulties. Lance Corporal Johnson sat on a chair with an ice pack pressed to his throat, his voice hoarse from the chokehold. Private Walsh had his arm in a temporary sling, wincing every time he tried to move it. Corporal Bennett was just regaining consciousness, blood caked around his nose, and a growing bruise on his forehead from his encounter with the wall. "This is going to require a very detailed investigation," Gonzalez muttered. The first challenge was getting coherent statements from the witnesses. Mickey's bar had been packed when the confrontation began, and everyone seemed to have a slightly different version of events. Some patrons had started recording with their phones partway through the fight, providing valuable evidence, but the quality was poor and the angles limited. What emerged from the initial interviews was a consistent narrative about the Marines' behavior leading up to the fight. Multiple witnesses confirmed that the 5 men had been drinking heavily and making inappropriate comments to female patrons. Several people had heard the crude proposition that had triggered Sarah's intervention. They were definitely the aggressors, testified Maria Santos, a local teacher who had been having dinner with friends. That poor young woman was just trying to have a quiet drink, and they wouldn't leave her alone. When she tried to defuse the situation politely, they escalated it. Tom Bradley, a construction worker, who'd been playing pool when the confrontation started, provided perhaps the most detailed account. "I saw the whole thing from the beginning. Those Marines were acting like jerks, harassing women and making everyone uncomfortable. When the lady cop stood up to them, they basically challenged her to a fight and said if she lost, she'd have to take her clothes off. It was disgusting." The physical evidence supported the witnesses' accounts. The knife that Bennett had pulled was bagged as evidence, along with the potted plant dirt that Walsh had tried to throw. The bar's security camera system had captured most of the confrontation from multiple angles, providing clear documentation of who had initiated each phase of the fight. But perhaps the most revealing evidence came from the Marines' own cell phones. Several of them had been recording earlier in the evening, documenting their bar crawl and inappropriate behavior. The videos showed them making crude comments about women, discussing their plans to score before the night was over, and generally displaying the kind of attitude that had led to the confrontation. As the investigation proceeded, a more complete picture of the 5 Marines began to emerge. This wasn't their first incident involving inappropriate behavior toward women. Military police records showed a pattern of complaints and minor disciplinary actions, though nothing serious enough to result in discharge. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the apparent leader of the group, had been written up twice in the past 6 months for conduct unbecoming. Lance Corporal Johnson had been involved in a bar fight 3 months earlier, though charges had been dropped when the other party declined to testify. Private Walsh had a history of drinking-related incidents. Corporal Bennett's record was the most troubling, with connections to extremist groups and a formal reprimand for hate speech. Only Private Chen appeared to have a relatively clean record, supporting Sarah's assessment that he'd been following the others rather than initiating trouble himself. The military implications of the incident were significant. Colonel James Patterson, the commanding officer of the Marines base, arrived at the hospital where the 4 injured men were being treated. A career military man with 30 years of service, Patterson had dealt with his share of disciplinary problems, but this situation was particularly embarrassing. "This is exactly the kind of behavior that gives the military a black eye," Patterson told Lieutenant Gonzalez during their meeting at the police station. "These men have disgraced their uniforms and embarrassed their service." The colonel was especially concerned about the weapons charge against Bennett. Military personnel were held to higher standards of conduct, and assault with a deadly weapon was the kind of offense that could result in a dishonorable discharge and significant prison time. "I want to be clear," Patterson continued. "The Marine Corps will cooperate fully with the civilian investigation and prosecution. These men will also face military justice under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Their actions reflect poorly on every Marine, and there will be consequences." Meanwhile, Sarah found herself dealing with an unexpected level of attention. Word of the incident had spread quickly through both the law enforcement community and military channels. Her fellow officers were impressed, but not entirely surprised. Most of them knew about her martial arts background and defensive tactic skills. "I've seen Sarah take down guys twice her size during training," said Sergeant Tom Mitchell, who had worked with her for 2 years. "But for Marines, that's next-level stuff." The attention wasn't entirely welcome. Sarah had always preferred to keep a low profile, focusing on her work rather than seeking recognition. But the story was too unusual to stay quiet for long. The local media picked up the story within 48 hours, though they initially got many of the details wrong. The first newspaper report described Sarah as a female police officer who fought off an attack by 5 drunken soldiers, missing the nuance of what had actually happened. Sarah declined most interview requests, but she did agree to speak with Detective Gonzalez for a more detailed statement. They met at the police station 2 days after the incident, in a small conference room with a recording device and a stenographer.
"Let's start from the beginning," Gonzalez said. "Tell me about your training background." Sarah's account of her martial arts education surprised even the experienced detective. Starting with her father's boxing instruction at age 6, she had accumulated an impressive array of skills over the years. Black belts in karate and Brazilian jiu-jitsu were just the foundation. She'd also trained in Muay Thai, wrestling, and various military hand-to-hand combat systems. "I've been competing in mixed martial arts for about 8 years, Sarah explained. "Underground circuits mostly, nothing official. My dad always said the best way to learn to fight was to actually fight."
Underground circuits?
Gonzalez asked with interest.
Nothing illegal, Sarah clarified quickly. Just small, local competitions that aren't sanctioned by the major organizations. Lower profile, fewer rules, more realistic fighting conditions. It's where you learn to adapt to different opponents and fighting styles. This explained a lot about what witnesses had observed during the bar fight. Sarah hadn't just relied on one martial art or fighting system. Against Rodriguez, she'd used judo throws and ground fighting. With Johnson, she'd employed close-quarters striking and submission holds. Against Walsh, she'd used joint locks and pain compliance techniques. Bennett had faced a combination of all these skills, plus her knife defense training.
"Each opponent required a different approach," Sarah explained. "Rodriguez was bigger and stronger, so I used his size against him with throws and leverage.
Johnson was a boxer, so I had to get inside his reach and negate his striking advantage. Walsh tried to fight dirty, so I had to be more aggressive. Bennett with the knife was the most dangerous. That required ending the threat immediately. The investigation also revealed the extent to which Sarah had controlled herself during the fights. Medical examinations of the 4 Marines showed that their injuries, while painful and temporarily disabling, were not serious or permanent. Rodriguez had bruised ribs, but no fractures. Johnson's throat was sore but undamaged. Walsh's arm was hyperextended, but not dislocated. Even Bennett, who had pulled a knife, had only a broken nose and mild concussion. She could have seriously hurt any of them, observed Drs. Patricia Williams, the emergency room physician who treated the Marines. These injuries are consistent with someone who knew exactly how much force to use to neutralize a threat without causing lasting damage. This level of control, combined with Sarah's clear attempts to de-escalate the situation before resorting to violence, strengthened the case for self-defense. The district attorney's office reviewed the evidence and quickly determined that no charges would be filed against Sarah. The Marines faced a different outcome. All 5 were charged with various offenses, with Bennett facing the most serious charges due to the weapon. Rodriguez, Johnson, and Walsh were charged with assault, disorderly conduct, and harassment. Chen, partly due to Sarah's intervention on his behalf, faced only misdemeanor charges. The military justice process moved in parallel with the civilian courts. Colonel Patterson convened a court-martial for the 4 Marines who had actually engaged in violence, while Chen faced non-judicial punishment under Article 15 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The hearings revealed additional details about the Marines' behavior that evening and their attitudes toward women in general. Text messages recovered from their phones showed a pattern of treating women as objects for their entertainment, with crude discussions about conquest and domination. Of particular concern were communications found on Bennett's phone, which included connections to online forums promoting misogynistic and extremist views. Military investigators discovered that Bennett had been attempting to recruit other Marines to his ideology, though with limited success. "This goes beyond a simple bar fight," Colonel Patterson told the court-martial panel. "These men displayed a fundamental lack of respect for civilian authority, for women, and for the values the Marine Corps is supposed to represent." The sentences reflected the seriousness of the offenses. Bennett received a dishonorable discharge and 18 months in military prison. Rodriguez and Johnson were reduced in rank and given 6 months of confinement. Walsh received 90 days and a formal reprimand. Chen was allowed to remain in service but received 30 days of extra duty and mandatory counseling. The civilian courts were equally decisive. Bennett pled guilty to assault with a deadly weapon and received 2 years in state prison. The others accepted plea deals that included significant fines, community service, and mandatory anger management classes. Throughout the legal proceedings, Sarah maintained her desire to stay out of the spotlight. She testified when required, but declined most media requests and avoided discussing the incident with anyone outside of official channels. "I just did what I had to do," she told Lieutenant Gonzalez during one of their final meetings. These men needed to understand that their behavior had consequences. "I'm glad no one was seriously hurt, and I hope they learn from this experience." The incident had broader implications for both the police department and the Marine Corps. Sarah's department used the case as a training example, highlighting the importance of de-escalation techniques and the value of diverse martial arts training for officers. The Marine Corps implemented new policies regarding off-duty conduct and alcohol consumption, while also expanding their diversity and inclusion training to address attitudes toward women and civilians. Mickey's Bar became something of a local legend, with the story of the confrontation growing in the telling. Mickey himself capitalized on the notoriety by hanging a small plaque near the spot where the fight had taken place. Sometimes the smallest person in the room is the most dangerous. But for Sarah, the incident was a reminder of something her father had taught her long ago. Being underestimated could be an advantage, but it also came with responsibility. Those who possessed skills had an obligation to use them wisely and only when necessary. As the legal proceedings wound down and media attention faded, Sarah returned to her regular duties as a patrol officer. The incident had earned her respect among her colleagues and recognition from her superiors, but it hadn't changed her fundamental approach to law enforcement. She continued to prefer de-escalation over confrontation, reasoning over force. But everyone who worked with her now knew that when push came to shove, Officer Sarah Martinez was someone you definitely wanted on your side. 6 months after the incident at Mickey's Bar, the ripple effects were still being felt throughout the community. What had started as a single evening's confrontation had evolved into a catalyst for broader conversations about respect, accountability, and the abuse of power. Sarah Martinez found herself in an unexpected position. Despite her efforts to maintain a low profile, she had become something of a local celebrity. The story of the small police officer who had taken down 5 Marines had spread far beyond the immediate community, inspiring discussions about women's self-defense and the importance of standing up to bullies. "I never wanted to be famous," Sarah confided to her father during one of their regular training sessions in the garage. "I just wanted those guys to understand that their behavior was unacceptable." Miguel Martinez smiled as he watched his daughter work the heavy bag with the same precision and control she'd always possessed. "Sometimes, mija, we don't get to choose when we make a stand. But when the moment comes, we have to be ready." The incident had indeed changed Sarah's life, though not always in ways she appreciated. She'd been approached by several martial arts schools about teaching women's self-defense classes. A publisher had contacted her about writing a book. A documentary filmmaker wanted to tell her story. She declined most of these opportunities, preferring to focus on her police work. However, she had agreed to one significant change. The police department had asked her to help develop a new training program for officer safety and defensive tactics. Her experience and skills were too valuable not to share with other officers who might find themselves in similar situations. What Sarah demonstrated that night, explained Chief Robert Davidson during a department meeting, is that size and strength aren't the most important factors in a physical confrontation. Skill, preparation, and mental toughness matter more. The training program Sarah developed emphasized de-escalation first, but also prepared officers for situations where physical intervention became necessary. She taught techniques from multiple martial arts, focusing on efficiency and control rather than brute force. The goal is never to hurt someone more than necessary, Sarah explained to a group of rookie officers during one training session. You want to neutralize the threat as quickly as possible while minimizing injury to everyone involved, including yourself. Her classes quickly became some of the most popular in the department. Officers appreciated learning from someone who had proven her skills in real-world conditions. and Sarah's teaching style emphasized practical application over theoretical knowledge. Meanwhile, the 5 Marines involved in the original incident were dealing with the long-term consequences of their actions. Their stories had diverged significantly in the months following their convictions. Corporal Bennett, the most serious offender, was serving his sentence in state prison. Reports from correctional officers suggested he remained unrepentant, continuing to associate with extremist groups and expressing anger about his conviction, rather than remorse for his actions. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and Lance Corporal Johnson had both been discharged from the Marines and were struggling to find employment. Their military records, combined with the publicity surrounding their case, made it difficult to find employers willing to hire them. Private Walsh had completed his sentence and was attempting to rebuild his life. He'd enrolled in anger management classes and substance abuse counseling, showing some signs of genuine change. However, the financial and personal costs of his conviction had been significant. Private Chen's path had been different. True to Sarah's assessment of his character, he had taken responsibility for his actions and used the experience as motivation for positive change. He'd completed his military service with an honorable record, largely due to Sarah's testimony about his cooperation and apparent remorse. After his discharge, Chen had written a letter to Sarah which she'd kept on her desk at work. "Officer Martinez, I know I can never fully make up for my actions that night, but I wanted you to know that the lesson you taught me has changed my life. I'm now working with a veterans organization that helps prevent sexual assault and harassment in the military. Every day I try to remember your words about standing up to friends when they're acting inappropriately. Thank you for giving me a second chance." The letter had meant more to Sarah than any of the commendations or recognition she'd received. It suggested that the confrontation had achieved its real purpose, not just stopping bad behavior in the moment, but potentially preventing future incidents. The incident had also sparked changes at the military base. Colonel Patterson had implemented comprehensive reforms in response to the embarrassment caused by his Marines' behavior. New policies required regular training on respectful treatment of civilians, particularly women. Off-duty conduct standards were strengthened, and there were consequences for commanders who failed to address problematic behavior among their troops. "We serve to protect all Americans," Patterson explained to his officers during a base-wide meeting. "That means treating every civilian with respect and dignity, whether they're in a position to defend themselves or not. The actions of those 5 Marines violated everything we stand for." The base had also established partnerships with local organizations focused on preventing sexual harassment and assault. Marines were required to participate in community service projects that brought them into positive contact with the civilians they were sworn to protect. Mickey's bar had undergone changes as well. The incident had forced Mickey to confront the reality that his establishment had become a place where harassment was tolerated, if not encouraged. He'd implemented new policies about staff intervention when customers behaved inappropriately, and hired additional security personnel trained in conflict de-escalation. "I realized that what happened that night could have been prevented if I'd stepped in earlier," Mickey admitted to Sarah when she stopped by several months later. "I was so focused on not losing customers that I forgot about creating a safe environment for everyone." The bar now displayed posters about respecting other patrons and had established clear consequences for harassment. Mickey had also reached out to local women's groups to discuss additional safety measures. The broader community had engaged in extensive discussion about the issues raised by the incident. Town halls, newspaper editorials, and social media debates had explored questions about military-civilian relations, women's safety, and bystander intervention. Some of these discussions had been uncomfortable. There were community members who felt that Sarah had been too aggressive in her response, that she should have simply called for backup rather than engaging in physical confrontation. Others argued that the Marines had been unfairly punished for what amounted to typical drunk behavior. But the majority of community members supported Sarah's actions and appreciated the broader conversations that had resulted. Local women's organizations reported increased enrollment in self-defense classes. Parents talked to their children about respect and consent. Employers reviewed their policies on harassment and inappropriate behavior. Sarah had been invited to speak at several community events, though she remained selective about her appearances. When she did speak, her message was consistent. Everyone had a responsibility to stand up to inappropriate behavior, but that standing up could take many forms. Physical confrontation should always be the last resort, she told an audience at the local community college. Most situations can be de-escalated through words, through getting help, or through removing yourself from danger. But sometimes when you're confronted with predatory behavior and you have the skills to stop it, you have an obligation to act. Her appearance at the college had been particularly meaningful because many of the students were young women facing their own challenges with harassment and assault. Sarah's story provided them with an example of someone who had refused to be victimized, while her training background offered practical tools for self-protection. The incident had also caught the attention of law enforcement professionals beyond Sarah's immediate department. She'd been invited to speak at conferences and training sessions across the state, sharing her experience and the lessons learned from the confrontation. What Officer Martinez demonstrated, explained Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a criminologist who studied police use of force, is that effective law enforcement isn't always about size and intimidation. Sometimes it's about skill, intelligence, and the courage to do what's right even when you're outnumbered. These speaking engagements had given Sarah a platform to advocate for improved training and better support for officers who found themselves in difficult situations. She emphasized the importance of diverse backgrounds and skills within law enforcement, arguing that departments benefited from officers who brought different perspectives and abilities. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of the incident was its effect on Sarah herself. The confrontation had forced her to examine her own motivations and goals, both as a police officer and as a person. I realized that I'd been hiding my skills for most of my career, Sarah reflected during an interview with the police department's newsletter. I was worried about standing out or being seen as too aggressive. But that night taught me that hiding your abilities doesn't serve anyone. If you have skills that can help people, you have a responsibility to use them. This realization led Sarah to become more active in her community beyond her police work. She began volunteering with organizations that worked with at-risk youth, teaching conflict resolution and self-defense. She joined the board of a local women's shelter, using her law enforcement experience to help improve security and safety protocols. She also continued her own training, recognizing that skills needed constant refinement to remain effective. Her father had taught her that learning never stopped, and the incident at Mickey's bar had reinforced that lesson. Every situation is different, Miguel Martinez observed as he watched his daughter spar with a training partner. You can't prepare for every possibility, but you can develop the skills and mindset to adapt to whatever comes your way. The relationship between Sarah and her father had deepened through the aftermath of the incident. He was proud of how she'd handled herself. But more importantly, he was proud of how she'd used the experience to help others. When I started teaching you to fight, he told her, I hoped you'd never need those skills. But if you did need them, I wanted you to be ready. You were ready that night, and you've been ready for everything that's come after. A year after the incident, Sarah received a letter that surprised her. It was from Rodriguez, the staff sergeant who had been the first Marine she'd fought. Officer Martinez. The letter read, I wanted to write to apologize for my behavior that night and to thank you for the lesson you taught me. I know that probably sounds strange, but losing that fight was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to confront the person I'd become and to start the process of changing. I've been in therapy for 8 months now, working through the anger and resentment that led to my behavior. I've realized that I was using my size and military status to intimidate people, especially women, because it made me feel powerful. Your response showed me how wrong I was and how pathetic that behavior really was. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know that your actions that night didn't just stop one incident of harassment. They started a process of change that has made me a better person. I hope that means something. Sarah kept the letter, adding it to the small collection of correspondence she'd received from people affected by the incident. Each letter reminded her that individual actions could have far-reaching consequences, that standing up for what was right could inspire others to examine their own behavior. As she reflected on everything that had happened since that evening at Mickey's bar, Sarah realized that her father had been right about more than just fighting techniques. Sometimes you didn't get to choose when to make a stand, but when the moment came, being prepared, physically, mentally, and morally, made all the difference. The incident had taught her that strength came in many forms, that true power meant using your abilities to protect others rather than to dominate them. It had shown her that even the smallest person could make a significant impact when they refused to be intimidated or silenced. Most importantly, it had reinforced her belief that everyone had a responsibility to stand up to bullying and harassment, whether they were police officers or private citizens, whether they had martial arts training or simply the courage to speak up. Sar Martinez continued her work as a police officer, but she carried with her the knowledge that she had inspired others to be stronger, braver, and more willing to do what was right. The 5 Marines had tried to make her remove her pants, but instead, she had stripped away their assumptions about power and shown them and everyone else who heard the story what real strength looked like. In the end, that may have been the most important victory of all.